Our scripture reading today is Matthew 5. First of all, we'll do 21 through 26. You have heard that it was said to those of old, "You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment." But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment, and whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, "You fool," will be liable to the hell of fire. So if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there, and then first be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly, I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. And then verse 38 of the same chapter. You have heard that it was said, "An eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth." But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse from the one who would borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, "You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect. This is God's word for us today.
All right, if you have a Bible with you, go ahead and open it up to that passage that Susan just read, Matthew chapter 5. Matthew is the first of 4 stories from the life of Jesus, towards the back quarter of the Bible, where the words might turn red in your version. We're going to be in chapter 5, beginning at verse 21. While you're turning there, so the way that my week typically works is Monday afternoon is when I sit down to look at the passage that we're going to be talking about a whole 7 or 6 days later, where I begin to kind of work the study process and take a look at what Jesus taught here in this particular passage. But this Monday was an interesting one to do that because I was opening up and looking at Jesus' way of peacemaking as the Nashville school shooting news was coming through social media and kind of catching the first glimpses of, how the cycle goes. You hear like something about a city, or you see a city kind of trending on social media, and you kind of know what's happening next. And then the news breaks that there's another school shooting. And this past Monday, 6 people died at a small private Christian school down in Nashville. And I don't know what goes on for you, but for me, I have kind of that sadness and that grief that just like punches you in the gut right away, as kind of the photos of crying children come to you. I'm sure if you're a parent, there's a dread or there's a despair that you feel in that. But then the next thing that I feel is anger and like some resentment that this thing keeps happening in our world. I was in public middle school just 2 years after Columbine, back in 1991, and since then there have been 376 school shootings in our country in like 20 years. And I'm 34 now. I was like 13 then, and just like this is what I've grown up in. I'm sure maybe a lot of you feel the same. And it just kind of seems like by now we should have figured this out. We should have figured out there should be some kind of, because like it's already like 6 days later and we've moved on. Like there's like the 3 or 4 days where people yell and shout at each other, and people just get angry with each other and argue about all the issues. And then by 6 or 7 days later, we move on. We forget about it until the next school shooting happens. And it just seems like that shouldn't be the case. Like gun violence is now the #1 killer of children in our country. #1. More than car accidents, more than sickness, gun violence. And even in our city, so we had 45 homicides last year in the city of Akron, tied a record. And last year, Akron Police Department took 2,000 illegal firearms off of our streets. 2,000 confiscated, illegally owned firearms in our country, or in our city. And so that's all, like, we live in that cycle all the time, right? Where, like, we live in this where it happens and there's grief, there's shock, there's anger, there's fighting, there's politicizing, and then we move on. And it just seems like this violence that we live in is like corrosive, right? It does something to us. Like it deadens us. It sharpens our language about each other. It turns into some bitterness in our hearts. And it spills out into other places, right? I came across a poll that said 1/3 of Americans now believe that violence is justified to use against their government. 1/3 of Americans believe that violence is justified if I disagree with a government issue. That's a lot of people. And so we live in this world that's like just constantly caught in this cycle of outrage and anger that just spills over into violence everywhere that you look. And it seems like as followers of Jesus, we should be different, but oftentimes we're not, right? Because we get caught up in the anger. We get caught up in the frustration. We get caught up in the politicization in our world. And before long, followers of Jesus look and sound like just anyone else who's in the world around us. I was thinking Genesis 1 and 2, when you begin in the Bible, what you find is that God creates a world of peace, a world in which everything is as it should be. We have peace with God. We have peace with one another. We have peace with the world around us. There is no violence. There is no conflict. Everything is great. Genesis 3 comes in, and sin causes us to turn away from God and then turn away from one another, point the finger and blame one another. But that's often where we stop. But if we go to Genesis 4, you find that Cain murders his brother Abel. That's how quickly sin leads to violence. Sin and violence in the story of the Bible go hand in hand. Sin leads me to be violent towards other people. And so Cain feels anger at his brother, and God comes to him and he says, sin is crouching at the door and its desire is for you. In other words, that sin is not just like, oops, I did a bad thing. That sin actually wants to do something to us. It wants to control our hearts, and it wants to turn our hearts against other people. And after Cain murders his brother, what does he say when God comes to him? He says, am I my brother's keeper? In other words, I'm not responsible for that. There's nothing I could do about that. He's the one who killed him, but he turns and he says, I'm not responsible for the pain of that person. I don't have anything to do to bring peace and understanding and to engage in the violent world around me. He says, I don't want to be part of that. You see, this is what sin and violence do. They deaden us. And before long, it becomes super easy to just be violent towards people. And so as we look at the life of Jesus, this is what the series with our whole hearts has been about, is how did Jesus live his life? As Jesus lived his life to show us how to live, to invite us into a different way, as he says, follow me, how did he live his life in a world that, in his world, was angry, was violent? He lived in the shadow of several insurrections, and he lived in an oppressed country where Rome was in control, where there are crucifixions all the time. He lived in a very violent world. And yet, how did he live his life? And how might that lead us to live a different kind of life? If you look at the disciples that Jesus gathered around himself, he didn't just gather a whole bunch of nice, happy, smiley people. He gathered people from very different perspectives and opinions on the issues of the day. On the one hand, he had Matthew, who was a Jewish man, who was a tax collector, which means he was a friend of Rome, the oppressor. He collected money from the Jewish people and gave it to Rome. He was considered an enemy of his people. On the other hand, Simon the Zealot belonged to an extremist group that wanted to eradicate anyone who was in bed with Rome. And these are in Jesus' inner circle. Matthew and Simon. Simon would have wanted to kill Matthew. Matthew would have wanted to run away from Simon. And yet Jesus calls them together into a different way. In fact, this is what John Perkins, in his book, One Blood, he said this: Jesus intentionally brought together disciples who were very different, fishermen and tax collectors, not people who would naturally love one another, but he did this to show us what love looks like in practice. We have the privilege of putting the same kind of love on display as we love those in the body of Christ who don't look like us. That Jesus' community reflects this power of bringing different people together around something greater, something he called the kingdom of God. And that's what he's talking about in Matthew chapter 5, in this passage that we're going to look at this morning. He is on a mountainside, and he is teaching the longest teaching that he offers about what discipleship looks like, about what life in the kingdom of heaven looks like, how we're called to follow him. Matthew has structured his letter or his story in such a way that we should be reading Matthew 5 as a new 10 Commandments, as a new instruction for God's people and how they're called to live in this new reality that Jesus is opening up in his world. In Matthew chapter 5, the first passage that we're going to look at, Jesus is going to diagnose the source of our violence. Why it is that our world is so violent, why it is that we so often go to violence instead of other means. And so look in your Bibles at chapter 5, verse 21. Jesus said, "You've heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, 'You fool,' will be liable to the hell of fire." So Jesus first begins not with murder, not with the violence, but with the anger that festers in our hearts. Anger is an emotion that we all feel at some point or another. Right? Anger, oftentimes what anger is telling me is that I've been wronged in some kind of way. Right? It kind of is a warning sign that I haven't gotten what I wanted. Maybe there's been some sort of pain that I've experienced or some sort of injustice that I experienced. Anger is one of these emotions that tends to bubble up inside of us when things don't go our way. And so he begins there. He says, this all starts when you feel anger. Now, here's the important thing, though. Anger is not a fruit of the Spirit. Like, anger is not a fruit of the Spirit. What I mean by that, when Paul talks about what's the evidence that God's life is working in you, anger is not on the list. In fact, anger is in the list of the works of the flesh. How do I know that evil is trying to get a hold of me? How do I know that I'm operating outside of God and his kingdom? Is that I tend to be, as Paul says, I experience fits of anger, strife, and enmity. Anger is not a fruit of the Spirit. But now if you listen to the voices around us, like there are voices that will say, if you're not angry, you're not listening. Right? That there's this, everywhere you look, there's someone who wants you to be angry at someone. And the longer that you listen to talk radio, the longer that you listen to your favorite podcaster or YouTuber, the longer you listen to that, the more anger you take in, the more anger tends to grab hold of your guts, grabs hold of your inner life. Now, Paul in Ephesians 4, he does say this, though. He says, be angry, but do not sin. In other words, there is a righteous anger. There's an anger that God feels. There's an anger that Jesus feels towards evil and towards injustice. That injustice and violence moves the heart of God, and he is angry towards sin and enmity. But Paul also then says, don't let the sun go down on your anger, lest you give the devil a foothold. In other words, what he's saying is, if you allow this anger to continue to fester, if you continue to feed it, if you continue to listen to angry voices around you who are telling you that you need to be angry and you can't let up on your anger, what happens is you open up a space in your inner life for the enemy of God to grab hold of you and control you. And before long, he's got a foothold. He's got a stronghold. He's keeping you angry, and he's actually moving you away from God and his plans for your life. So Paul says, be angry, but do not sin. In other words, it's okay to be angry about righteous things, about issues in our world that don't line up with God's kingdom, but don't let the sun go down on that. In other words, don't fester on that and don't feed that, because you could end up giving your emotions over to something that's going to take you away from God. And so Jesus starts here in this place of anger, that when I allow my anger to fester, when I feed it with angry voices around me, what happens then is the second thing, othering. That when I other someone, I externalize my anger by applying a label or some sort of discrimination or prejudice against them. Jesus says this, that you insult his brother, or as he says, you fool, which in Aramaic is raka, which means empty-headed. That you devalue, you rob someone of dignity in your thoughts about them, in the language that you use about them. You dehumanize them. A study was done on how genocides take over countries, and stage 4 of a 10-stage process is dehumanization, which is where if you look through the history of human genocide, first there's anger, and then in the political rhetoric, in the cultural images and stereotypes, the people or people group that is the problem, considered to be the problem, are often associated with images of rodents and insects. You can look at that through the history of human genocide. That our language becomes an expression of our anger that dehumanizes and robs people of value and their dignity that they have as image bearers of God. And so this is why, as followers of Jesus, we should be really conscious of, really aware of the way that we describe people that we don't like. The language that we use for people that we would consider our enemies. Because the more I other someone, the more in my language I make you less than, the easier it then is to be violent against you. Because you're less than me. You're not as important as me. And so Jesus says the heart of murder begins in this place of anger that leads to othering, that then makes it easier for me to mistreat you, to abuse you, to be violent against you. But when I'm violent against you, what does that do to you? It creates pain in you, anger in you. It creates the same conditions that I was experiencing. So now you feel angry towards me. And so we enter into this cycle that we have lived in throughout human history of anger, othering, and violence. Now, Jesus' solution is what we're going to call peacemaking. He says, love your enemies. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. in his book, Strength to Love, he said this, why should we love our enemies? Why bother? He says, the first reason is fairly obvious. Returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. Hate multiplies hate, violence multiplies violence, and toughness multiplies toughness in a descending spiral of destruction. So when Jesus says, love your enemies, he is setting forth a profound and ultimately inescapable admonition. That Jesus' solution to an angry and violent world is peacemaking. Of engaging the anger in our world, not with more anger, not with more violence, not with more othering, but instead with this profound heart of reconciling love. This is why Jesus says the solution in verse 22, if you're offering your gift at the altar and then remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother. In other words, if you're in church this morning and you're offering your offering or you're offering your worship or you're coming to the communion table, he says, go be reconciled to that person before you come to this. Jesus places this equal sign between our reconciliation with God and our reconciliation with other people. In fact, in Matthew chapter 6, he says, if you do not forgive your brother, God will not forgive you. Like, that's a pretty big deal. He places this incredible significance on our ability and willingness to reconcile with the person who has hurt us, the person who's considered our enemy. Now, when we talk about peacemaking, right, we're looking at how Jesus lived his life. We're looking at this rule of life for our community, how we then live our lives together, following Jesus. This is the last of our 6 P's, peacemaking. And this is how we're going to define it. I want to show you how this then stems from Jesus' teaching in verse 38. Peacemaking means this, that we seek understanding and cultivate peace across our social, racial, ethnic, economic, and political differences. That we seek understanding and cultivate peace across our social, racial, ethnic, economic, and political differences. I tried to get all the words in there. There's probably a word that I missed. Let me know if there's another category with which we can somehow divide or other someone. We'll put it on the list. There is no exception to Jesus' call to seek reconciliation. Now, when we think peacemaking, we tend to think that Jesus calls us to be a doormat. That peacemaking means I'm just not a person who likes conflict. And so you may have an issue or you may have tension, but peacemaking means I just kind of sit and I don't say anything about it. But that's not peacemaking as Jesus teaches peacemaking. That peacemaking is not acting as if nothing is wrong. That's a false peace. And Jesus said he came to disrupt false peace. A false peace that just acts like everything is okay and we just put a smile on even though you're feeling the tension in your guts. Even though you're feeling the hatred in your heart, you act as if everything is okay. That's a false peace. Jesus instead calls us to confront conflict, to engage in conflict, and to proactively love those who are against us, to proactively love our enemies. Or as he says, pray for those who persecute you. Do good to those who seek ill of you. This is perhaps the hardest of all of Jesus' teachings, if we're honest. We can pray, and that's easy. But loving my enemy? No, thank you. But I want you to see in verse 38 through 48 how Jesus invites us to a proactive and a particularly nonviolent peacemaking. Proactive and nonviolent peacemaking through confronting evil with good. So it's not that we just allow evil to reign. We don't say anything, we don't confront it, but instead we confront it, but not with the same weapons that the world confronts it. We confront it with the good that God has given us, the dignity that God has given us, the power that we have as followers of Jesus. We confront it in nonviolent peacemaking kinds of ways. Jesus gives us 3 examples of what this looked like, 3 pictures, if you will, to wrap our minds around. And each one of these, we tend to think, means I'm a doormat, but if you understand the context, it's actually a much different reality. Verse 39, Jesus says the first situation, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Now in that culture, this would be a backhanded slap. I don't know if you've ever been backhanded slapped. I never have been. We could see if anyone wants to demonstrate. You see it in like comics. But the backhanded slap in that culture was the ultimate insult. Because I'm moving my hand towards you, I'm making contact with your face. Now, what happens when I'm the one who's receiving the slap? What happens to my body? All right, I get the slap here, like that little comic face. I get the slap, and my body turns away because I've experienced pain. But what Jesus says, turn the other cheek, what does that then invite me to do? You see, if someone has slapped me here and I'm here, my natural tendency is I'm going to keep going here and I'm going to go this way. I'm going to go away from the person. But instead, when he says turn the other cheek, he is saying you now need to confront that person with your face. Right? And that means that I have to make a decision to not react out of my anger, but to respond. Right? Oftentimes, right, physical violence comes not because I'm thinking about it, but because I'm reacting to it. I'm reacting to my emotions. I'm being controlled by my emotions. And so I'm slapping, I'm punching because my anger has control of me. But when I decide as a peacemaker to turn back and to turn the other cheek, I'm now facing the person who hit me in the face. They're looking at my face. My cheek is getting red. And I'm asking them to think about what they just did. See, Jesus is saying, confront the person. You don't sock them back. But instead, by standing there in front of you, I'm saying, I'm a human. And you just slapped me. So think about what you did. Right? I want you to make the same decision. Again, it is a proactive confronting when someone has wronged me with the dignity that I have as an image bearer of God, with the power of my presence, the power of my non-anxious, non-punching back presence. You now have to think about what you just did. It's turning the tables on them to cause them to think about their decisions. So Jesus is not saying, take all the punches you can get. He's saying that when someone reacts violently towards you, you don't react back to them. You think about who you are, you think about how God has made you, and you invite them to think about the same thing. This is a nonviolent, proactive peacemaking. The second example is actually really humorous once you get to it. Jesus says this, if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. Now here's what we miss. Most people in that context only wore two garments. You can see them right there, the tunic and the cloak. So what Jesus is saying is if someone sues you for your underwear, which I don't know, that's just humor. Jesus is a funny guy. Who is doing this? But Jesus is saying, if someone comes for your inner garment, this would be like, you can see it there, kind of a knee length or an ankle length inner shirt. This would be what you slept in. This is kind of what you wore all the time. And so if someone takes that from you, if they want to take that from you, you would at least have your cloak that you could cover yourself with. But when Jesus says, give them your cloak as well, the end result of that is that you are standing in front of that person stark naked. Which, if you've ever seen a naked person in public, it causes you to feel some things, right? I feel shame. I feel embarrassed. Right? So the wisdom of Jesus' teaching is that in essence, that your presence in front of them naked reveals the naked injustice of what they just did to you. It confronts them with the reality of how they've just mistreated you, how they've just abused you, how they have just taken everything from you. You see, Jesus is inviting us to consider what does it look like to creatively confront evil with good, to creatively confront evil, and to call it for what it is, and to turn the tables on the evildoers so that they are forced to think about their participation in evil and violence. The last one in verse 41, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. In that context, any Roman official could force anyone to carry a burden for 1 mile. So if you were just walking through Jerusalem, there's a Roman guard, he says, I'm tired of carrying my backpack, you carry it for 1 mile. You had to go with him. It was Roman law. And so this meant that whenever you saw a Roman official, you would run away from them. Say, I don't have time for that. I don't have time for forced labor today. I'm instead going to go the other direction. But Jesus says if someone does that to you, which would be a common occurrence, you can think about when Jesus is carrying his cross. Simon of Cyrene, a Libyan man who's in Jerusalem at the events of Passover, he is forced to carry the cross of Jesus. This is this law in action, that he couldn't say no. He's carrying the cross of Jesus, forced by Roman officials. This happened a lot. So what Jesus, though, says instead is when they force you with this unjust law to go 1 mile, you choose to go 2 miles. Now, what does that do? That turns the tables on them. Because where they had power over you for 1 mile, you're now choosing in your own power to go a 2nd mile. That they now don't have power over you over that mile. That you are now choosing to love them and to be generous to them. And it's very possible that by going with them 2 miles, they could come under judgment from their authorities for forcing someone to go beyond the lengths of the law. In other words, it brings them under judgment of the same law that they used to force you to carry that load. It is confronting the injustice of the laws of that day with creative peacemaking and confrontation of evil. Not with violence, but with creative action. You see, Jesus calls us to be peacemakers, but this is why we struggle with this. Because in order to do that, I have to make a decision to be vulnerable. In each one of those scenarios, I have to decide to be vulnerable. Like there's a moment where someone slaps me and everything in me wants to get defensive and angry and punch back and push back and hit back. But the moment that I decide to turn and face them, I am now very vulnerable because they could hit me again. The moment that I decide to give my cloak to the one who took my tunic from me, I am incredibly vulnerable. I'm naked in front of them. The moment that I go more than 1 mile, I'm now vulnerable to that Roman soldier. I'm further from home. I'm being forced to do even more. I'm vulnerable in that moment. And this is why when we actually get into conflict, when we actually get into dealing with confronting evil, confronting pain, we would rather get defensive. We'd rather stockpile our weapons. We'd rather build our fences and label our enemies than we would love our enemies. Because it requires that I be vulnerable, and in that vulnerability, trust that Jesus knows what he's talking about. That Jesus means what he's talking about. That's why Jesus goes on, he says this, you've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who's in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. In other words, what he's saying is God is actively involved in your world. And so when you are vulnerable in that moment, God has not forgotten you. God is somehow not, he is still on the throne. He is still active and bringing rain, bringing sun on you and the person who is oppressing you. In other words, it's an invitation to realize that in the moment that I choose to be vulnerable so that I can practice peacemaking like Jesus, I am trusting that my God is actively involved in my situation. And that in that moment, while I would rather choose to be defensive, I'm instead choosing to trust that God knows what he's doing. And that as I trust him, he's going to work out a situation that I may not even see, that I may not even understand right now, but I'm going to choose in this moment where I would rather be defensive to trust that as I am vulnerable, that God is going to take care of me. And that he might even turn my enemy into my friend. That he might even change the hearts of my enemy so that they might go from being unjust to being just, from not knowing God to knowing God. You see, this is why peacemaking is a distinctly Christian way of love. Jesus says this, he says, who cares if you love your friends? Everyone loves their friends. He says even tax collectors do that. True Christian love is not just like I feel great and happy about everyone. True Christian love in the way of Jesus is a love for my enemies. Because after all, isn't that what Jesus did for us? Right? Where we resist turning the other cheek because we get slapped, Jesus was slapped and beaten and whipped and mocked and spat upon. Where we don't want to give our cloak and be seen as naked, Jesus was stripped naked, paraded through the towns, mocked and jeered and hung on a cross. Where we don't want to go the extra mile, Jesus carried a cross for us so that you and I, who were enemies of God, in other words, if we were there on that day, we would be in the crowd jeering. We would be in that crowd punching Jesus. We would be in that crowd spitting on him. And what was Jesus doing in that moment? He was not resisting. He was confronting evil with his redemptive good. This is what Paul says in Colossians 1:19 and 20. He says this, for in him, in Jesus, all of the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. In other words, everything that God is and everything that God cares about was wrapped up in who Jesus is and what Jesus was doing. And through him to reconcile to himself, to make peace to himself, all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. That he died so that you and I could no longer be enemies of God, but be called friends of God, even family of God, even children of God. And so when Jesus says that as a peacemaker, you are sons of your Father in heaven, that when we seek to make peace with our enemies, we are looking just like our dad. We're looking just like the God that we claim to follow when we choose to love our enemies, because that is what God did for us when he offered his son on the cross so that we could be reconciled. See, this is why this practice of peacemaking is not optional in the way of Jesus. Because it is, in fact, in our peacemaking that we look most like the Jesus that we claim to follow. The Jesus who, in this week, as we approach Good Friday, gives his life for us. He is buried and seemingly to have been overcome by evil. And yet, Resurrection Sunday reminds us that evil and death do not get the final word, but that Jesus and his kingdom and Jesus and his way are the way to life and life everlasting. And so the practice of peacemaking, there's 3 circles I want to talk through, but the first circle is the most important circle, and that is peacemaking between you and God. Peacemaking between you and God. That God has sought to reconcile you to him. That your sin, every time that I choose to do things my own way, every time that I choose to be angry or to be lustful or to do all the things, that it's a slap in the face to God. And that's the gravity of sin. That sin is an offense to God. But God has, in his grace and his mercy for us, offered Jesus, who takes the punishment for our sin, who takes the weight of our sin on his shoulders and dies in our place. You see, the only person who can reconcile is the person who has been hurt. All right? If I punch this Steve over here cannot offer me forgiveness. And they're both Steve, if you didn't know that. Why? Because the one who has hurt, the one who has been hurt, is the only one who can offer forgiveness. And so your sin and my sin is an offense and an affront to God, a slap in the face to him. And yet he chooses in his love and his grace for us to offer Jesus instead. This is the heart of the gospel, and this is the heart of peacemaking. And until you have discovered this, until you have acknowledged, yes, I have in fact slapped in God's face. Yes, I have in fact turned from God. Yes, I have in fact perpetuated evil in my own ways. You have not been reconciled to God. Because turning and trusting him requires acknowledging, yes, I in fact have done that. Yes, I have in fact sinned. Yes, I have in fact turned from you. And to embrace the free gift that Jesus offers you as he reconciles you to himself through his death and his resurrection. This is the heart of peacemaking. Right? This is where we get the power to confront peacemaking as we understand how far God went to make peace between us and him. We will understand that there is no greater divide, no greater conflict, no greater lack of reconciliation that we will face in our world if God went that far for you and me. And so if you hear nothing else this morning, hear this, that God reconciled you to himself. And he invites you to turn and trust in him. That this is the whole point and the whole heart of why Jesus came. The second circle is reconciliation between you and your brother or sister. Jesus is very clear that reconciliation with God leads us to reconciliation with others. It leads us to engage in conflict. Right? Not to be passive and say everything is fine even though inwardly you're stirring, you're stewing over it. Right, to actively engage in healthy conflict, to disrupt false peace so that you can forge true unity. The followers of Jesus are called to engage conflict in healthy kinds of ways, to name when I feel hurt, to go to the one who has hurt me rather than going to my friend and telling them about how I've been hurt. I go to the person who has hurt me and I confront it. I name it and I seek reconciliation in it. I don't seek retribution. But instead, I seek unity. Jesus prayed the night before he was betrayed, he prayed that the church would be unified. And that in our unity, we would reflect the God who makes peace. And so when we just divide over all of our tensions, over all of our conflicts, over all of our issues, we are running counter to how Jesus wants us to live. And so engaging in healthy conflict is part of following Jesus. To say, when I feel tension, I'm not going to just ignore it, and I'm not going to gossip about it over here, but I'm going to go talk to the person I feel this tension with. Because God calls me to be a peacemaker. Dr. King said, true peace is not merely the absence of tension, it's the presence of justice. In other words, peace is not just, I'm just going to ignore this tension. It's instead engaging so that we can forge true unity. The last circle, however, is peacemaking between the world. That Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. The assumption is that we, as followers of Jesus, are going to be in places where there is conflict. Not that we are running from conflict and forging kind of havens over here where there is no conflict, but that we are moving towards places in our world where there is pain, where there is evil, where there is injustice, and confronting it through nonviolent peacemaking. To actually be a redemptive presence in the world, as Paul would say, ambassadors for a different kingdom. So when you see conflict in your community, when we see young people being gunned down in our streets, we should care about that. And rather than kind of run from that, we should run towards the pain and run towards the brokenness. Why? Because that's what God did for us. He moved into the places of pain and brokenness in order to forge true peace and true unity. And so being a peacemaker requires and invites us to not run away from conflict in our communities, but move towards it as a redemptive presence, as a peacemaking presence. Because after all, if we have been freed from the entanglements of sin, right, if we have been redeemed and reconciled to God, then who better to forge peace in our communities than those who know the peacemaking God that we follow? And I think part of this also requires that we do this non-violently. That we do this non-violently. Because Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And how can I love my enemy? And how can I pray for them when they persecute me if I've got a gun in their face? And this, here's the thing. All the times that I've been preaching for 10 years, this is the number one way where people get angry with me. And I think because this is where we really feel vulnerable. That the way of Jesus leads us to nonviolence, where I don't take matters into my own hands, but instead I follow my Messiah. I follow my King in his way of laying down his life for his enemies. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus is praying and he knows what's coming. And the guards come to him. They're about to take him violently. They're about to arrest him. And one of his disciples pulls a sword and cuts off the ear of one of the guards. And Jesus says, enough of this. He says, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. In other words, he's saying, don't use the weapons of this world in my way. And the early church believed this and followed this. In fact, Tertullian, who lived 160 to 220 AD, he's the guy who coined the term Trinity. This is what he taught. In disarming Peter, Jesus disarms all Christians. That when Jesus takes the sword from Peter, he takes the sword, the weapon, the gun from followers of Jesus. And I know, like, as soon as you say this, like, there's arguments that you want to throw my way. And we can have those robust conversations, but I just think that following Jesus in this way, how can I kill someone I'm called to love? And I think this is so important for us to get because our world is so violent. And it is so easy to go there. But Jesus calls us to something better, to be a peacemaker. And so in being a peacemaker, you and I will look like our Father in heaven. That we will look like the very God that we are offering to people, the God who made peace. How? Through the blood of the cross. That this is how we demonstrate the power of the gospel in the world around us. As we trust that our God is in fact working in our world, that he does in fact call us to forge peace in difficult places, following our crucified King. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons and daughters of God. Let me pray for us. God, as we talk about this, I know that there are a lot of places that we could go in our hearts, a lot of places that we could go in our feelings. Anger, that often covers pain. Fear, that wants us to be defensive. But Jesus, this week reminds us that you moved towards vulnerability. You moved towards loving your enemies. That even as you hung on the cross, you spoke words of forgiveness to the soldiers who put those nails in your hands. And God, we confess that this is very, very, very hard to do. The world around us wants us to be angry, that my flesh wants me to be angry. But God, you forged peace between me and you offer all of us a way to be reconciled through your Son. God, for the one who's here this morning who maybe has never considered that their sin is an affront to you, that their sin is an offense to you, would you invite them to see the reconciliation that you offer them through Jesus? God, for all the ways in which we have been defensive, that we've been angry, that we've tried to take matters into our own hands, God, would you convict us of those things and give us the courage to walk your way forward? Pray this in the name of the crucified Jesus. Amen.